The morning of August 7, 1942, dawned with deceptive tranquility over the Solomon Islands. Marine Private First Class Robert Leckie pressed his sweating palms against the steel rail of the transport ship, watching as the emerald, massive Guadalcanal emerged from the Pacific mist like a sleeping giant. The island's dense jungle canopy stretched endlessly toward volcanic peaks, betraying nothing of the hell that would soon unfold beneath its verdant surface. "Looks peaceful enough," muttered Sergeant John Bossalone, adjusting his machine gun belt as he joined Leckie at the rail. The veteran's weathered face bore the confidence of a man who had seen combat, yet even he couldn't suppress the nervous energy that rippled through the 1st Marine Division. Like an electric current. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's voice crackled over the ship's loudspeaker, cutting through the tropical morning air. "Gentlemen, today we take our first step toward Tokyo. The Japanese have been constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal. For 3 months, if completed, it will threaten our supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. We cannot allow this fortress to stand." Below deck, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller gathered his battalion commanders round a makeshift table, covered with aerial reconnaissance photographs. The images revealed a partially completed airstrip carved from the jungle near Lunga Point, surrounded by defensive positions that looked like angry scars across the island's face. Intelligence reports estimated 1,500 Japanese troops on the island, but Puller's instincts told him the enemy was stronger than anyone suspected. As referenced in historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the strategic importance of Guadalcanal had become apparent to both sides. Following Japan's rapid advance across the Pacific, the island sat like a cork in a bottle, capable of controlling sea lanes that were vital to Allied operations in the South Pacific. The first landing craft hit the beaches at Red Beach near Lunga Point. At precisely 9:10 in the morning, Marines poured ashore expecting fierce resistance, but found only scattered rifle fire and hastily abandoned positions. The Japanese construction crews and their military escorts had melted into the jungle like ghosts, leaving behind half-eaten meals and smoking equipment. Captain James Jones led his company inland through the suffocating humidity, following a trail that disappeared and reappeared like a mirage. The silence was unnerving. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, could signal an ambush. The Marines had trained for beach assaults and urban warfare, but nothing had prepared them for this green hell where the jungle itself seemed to be their enemy. By afternoon, the Marines had secured the partially completed airfield without significant opposition. They would rename it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, killed at the Battle of Midway. But as they dug their first foxholes in the coral sand, none of them realized they had just walked into a trap that would hold them for the next 6 months. Japanese observers hidden in the jungle hills watched every movement through binoculars, counting men and equipment. Radio messages crackled back to Imperial headquarters in Rabaul, where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was already planning a counterattack that would turn this seemingly easy victory into America's first prolonged ground campaign of the Pacific War. The sun set over Guadalcanal like a crimson warning, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. In the gathering darkness, the Marines could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines approaching from the northwest. The battle for Guadalcanal was about to begin in earnest. Colonel Kyote Kawaguchi crouched in the dense jungle undergrowth, his binoculars trained on the American positions below. 3 weeks had passed since the Marines landed, and the element of surprise was about to shift dramatically. His 24th Infantry Regiment, along with reinforcements from the Ichiki Detachment, had been moving through the jungle for days, preparing for what Japanese commanders called the decisive battle. The night of August 21st brought the first major test of American resolve. Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao, confident in his troops' superior night fighting abilities, launched a frontal assault against Marine positions. Along the Tanaru River, the Japanese soldiers, their bayonets gleaming in the moonlight, charged across the sandbar with terrifying battle cries that echoed through the coconut groves. Sergeant Basilone's machine gun position erupted in a deadly rhythm, cutting down waves of attackers as they emerged from the tree line. "Keep firing. Don't let them reach the wire," he shouted over the din of battle. The Marines had learned to fight in the darkness, using interlocking fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing ground. Lieutenant Colonel Harold "Red" Mike Edson, commanding the Marine Raiders, watched the battle unfold from his command post. The ferocity of the Japanese attack was unlike anything the Americans had encountered. These weren't the demoralized garrison troops they had expected, but elite infantry units trained in the Bushido tradition of death before dishonor. Dawn revealed the true cost of the night's fighting. More than 800 Japanese bodies lay scattered across the sand, while American casualties numbered fewer than 50. Colonel Ichiki, his attack shattered, committed seppuku rather than face the shame of defeat. His sword, found beside his body, would later be presented to General Douglas MacArthur as a war trophy. But the victory came at a price beyond mere casualties. The Americans now understood they faced an enemy who would never surrender, never retreat, and would fight to the death for every yard of jungle. The rules of warfare in the Pacific had been written in blood on the beaches of Guadalcanal. As documented in reports from war correspondent Richard Trigaskis, the psychological impact of these early battles was immense. Marines who had expected a quick victory found themselves trapped in a war of attrition that would test their endurance to the breaking point. The Japanese response was swift and overwhelming. Admiral Yamamoto dispatched the combined fleet to retake the island, leading to a series of naval battles that would turn the waters around Guadalcanal into a graveyard of ships. The area became known as Iron Bottom Sound for the dozens of vessels that would rest on its floor. Before the campaign ended, Captain Reizo Tanaka's destroyer flotilla began making regular night runs down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, delivering troops and supplies to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal. The Americans called these midnight supply runs the Tokyo Express, and they became a deadly game of cat and mouse that continued for months. Marine aviators at Henderson Field, led by Major John Smith and Captain Marion Carl, fought desperate battles against overwhelming odds. Their Grumman Wildcats and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers faced constant attacks from Japanese Zeros and Betty bombers launched from Rabaul. The airfield, constructed from pierced steel planking and coral fill, became both a lifeline and a target. The jungle itself emerged as perhaps the most relentless enemy. Tropical diseases decimated both sides, while the constant humidity rotted equipment and sapped the strength of even the hardiest soldiers. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery became as dangerous as enemy bullets. As September approached, both sides prepared for the next phase of the campaign. The Americans clung to their precarious foothold around Henderson Field, while the Japanese massed forces for a decisive push that would either drive the Marines into the sea or mark the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. The morning of September 12, 1942, brought an ominous silence to the jungle ridges south of Henderson Field. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt "Red" Mike Edson adjusted his field glasses, scanning the dense foliage that concealed what intelligence reports claimed was a major Japanese buildup. His Marine Raiders and paratroopers had been moved to defend a low coral ridge that commanded the approaches to the vital airfield. Colonel Kawaguchi's plan was audacious in its complexity. Nearly 6,000 Japanese troops would converge on the American positions from 3 directions, with the main assault focused on the ridge that Edson's 800 Marines now called home. The Japanese commander was confident that his superior numbers and night fighting expertise would overwhelm the defenders and secure Henderson Field by dawn. The preliminary bombardment began at sunset. Japanese cruisers and destroyers, led by Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, pounded the Marine positions with devastating accuracy. The naval gunfire was followed by artillery strikes from mountain guns that the Japanese had somehow managed to drag through the jungle. The earth trembled beneath the Marines' feet as high explosive shells tore through their defensive positions. Private First Class Mitchell Page pressed himself against the coral as shrapnel whistled. Overhead, the young Marine from Pennsylvania had never experienced anything like the sustained bombardment. Around him, his fellow Marines huddled in whatever cover they could find, their faces grim with the knowledge that this was merely the prelude to the real battle. As darkness fell, the Japanese assault began with characteristic ferocity. Waves of soldiers emerged from the jungle, their officers leading with samurai swords raised high. The distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the staccato burst of Nambu machine guns. As the attackers pressed forward through the undergrowth, Edson moved among his men like a man possessed, appearing wherever the fighting was heaviest. "Hold the line, make every shot count," he shouted over the din of battle. His presence seemed to inspire the Marines, who fought with desperate courage. Against overwhelming odds, the battle raged through the night. With positions changing hands multiple times, Japanese infiltrators, moving with cat-like stealth, penetrated deep into Marine lines before being discovered and eliminated in savage, hand-to-hand combat. The sound of steel on steel echoed through the jungle as bayonets and combat knives decided the fate of individual foxholes. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Marine Corps' historical center, the fighting on what became known as Bloody Ridge represented some of the most intense combat of the entire Pacific campaign. The Marines, outnumbered nearly 8-1, held their ground through sheer determination and superior firepower. Sergeant Basilone's machine gun section became the anchor of the defense. Throughout the night, his guns maintained their deadly rhythm, cutting down Japanese attackers as they attempted to storm the ridge. When ammunition ran low, Marines stripped clips from the bodies of fallen enemies, using captured weapons to continue the fight. Captain Bailey's mortar section provided crucial support, dropping high-explosive rounds with pinpoint accuracy onto Japanese assembly areas. The Marines had learned to coordinate their fires with deadly efficiency, creating killing zones that channeled the attackers into prepared positions. As dawn approached, the Japanese assault began to falter. Colonel Kawaguchi, watching his carefully planned attack dissolve into chaos, ordered a general withdrawal. His casualties were staggering. Nearly 1,500 men killed or wounded in a single night's fighting. The survivors melted back into the jungle like ghosts, leaving behind a ridge littered with the dead. The Marines had held, but at a terrible cost. Of Edson's original 800 defenders, fewer than 400 remained fit for duty. The Coral Ridge, now permanently stained with blood, had earned its grim nickname through the sacrifice of young Americans who refused to yield. For his leadership during the battle, Lieutenant Colonel Edson would receive the Medal of Honor. But the real victory belonged to the ordinary Marines who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. Their stand on Bloody Ridge had saved Henderson Field and marked the beginning of Japan's retreat. Across the Pacific, the morning sun revealed the true scope of the carnage. Japanese bodies lay scattered across the ridge like broken dolls, while American wounded filled every available shelter. The battle for Guadalcanal was far from over, but the Marines had proven they could match the Japanese in both courage and tenacity. Admiral Daniel Callahan gripped the bridge rail of the heavy cruiser San Francisco as his task force steamed through the black waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The date was November 13, 1942, and intelligence reports indicated a massive Japanese naval force was approaching Guadalcanal with the intention of bombarding Henderson Field into rubble. The approaching enemy fleet was formidable. The battleships Haie and Kirishima, commanded by Admiral Hiroaki Abe, along with a screen of cruisers and destroyers. Their mission was simple but devastating: pulverize the American airfield and pave the way for a major Japanese ground offensive that would finally drive the Marines from the island. Callaghan's force was outgunned and outnumbered. His flagship, San Francisco, led a column that included the cruiser Atlanta for destroyers and 8 other vessels against 2 battleships and their escorts. The odds were heavily stacked against the Americans, but Callahan had one advantage the Japanese didn't expect: radar. The night battle that followed would become legendary in naval history. At precisely 1:50 in the morning, the opposing forces collided in the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and Florida Island. The engagement opened with a devastating exchange of gunfire that lit up the darkness like a deadly fireworks display. Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless, serving as communications officer aboard San Francisco, watched in awe as tracer rounds streaked across the water like shooting stars. The sound was indescribable, a continuous thunder of naval gunfire, mixed with the shriek of incoming shells and the crash of explosions against armored hulls. The destroyer Cushing, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Edward Parker, led the American column into battle. Her 5-inch guns blazed away at the Japanese battleship Hiei, scoring hits that started fires on the enemy's superstructure. But the destroyer's gallant attack drew the attention of multiple Japanese vessels. As she was soon overwhelmed by return fire, Admiral Callahan, realizing his ships were intermixed with the enemy in a chaotic melee, gave the order that would define the battle: odd ships fire to starboard, even ships fire to port. The Americans fought with desperate courage, their smaller vessels trading blows with enemy battleships at point-blank range. The cruiser Atlanta, caught between friendly and enemy fire, suffered catastrophic damage. Admiral Norman Scott, the hero of the Battle of Cape Esperance, was killed on her bridge along with most of the ship's senior officers. The vessel's superstructure was riddled with holes, and she began listing heavily to port. As documented in official Navy records archived at the Naval War College, the battle represented a turning point in naval warfare. The Americans had proven that aggressive tactics and superior fire control could overcome numerical disadvantage, even against the mighty Japanese fleet. The battleship Hiei, pride of the Imperial Navy, found herself under attack from multiple directions. The destroyer Laffey, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hank, closed it within 20 yards of the Japanese giant before launching a spread of torpedoes. The destroyer's guns blazed away at the battleship's bridge, killing and wounding several senior officers. San Francisco engaged both enemy battleships simultaneously, her 8-inch guns punching holes through armor plate and starting fires that would eventually prove fatal. Admiral Callahan, standing on his bridge, directed the battle personally until a Japanese shell silenced his voice forever. The melee continued for 37 minutes of pure chaos. Ships fired at targets they could barely see, relying on muzzle flashes and burning vessels to identify friend from foe. The water around Guadalcanal became a cauldron of destruction, as vessels from both sides absorbed punishment that would have sunk them in peacetime. When dawn broke, the true cost of the battle became apparent. The Americans had lost 2 cruisers, and 4 destroyers, with heavy damage to most surviving vessels. But the Japanese had paid an even steeper price. The battleship Hiei, battered and burning, limped away from the battle, only to be finished off by American aircraft the following day. More importantly, the Japanese bombardment mission had failed completely. Henderson Field remained operational, and the planned ground offensive had to be postponed. The Marines would continue to hold their precarious foothold on Guadalcanal, supported by a Navy that had proven it would fight to the death to keep them supplied. The waters around Guadalcanal had claimed so many ships that sailors began calling the area Iron Bottom Sound. The Battle of Guadalcanal had exacted a terrible price from both sides, but it had also demonstrated that the tide of war in the Pacific was beginning to turn. Major General Alexander Vandegrift stood in his command bunker, studying the intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of Japanese intentions. It was late November 1942, and the enemy was preparing for what appeared to be their final, decisive push to recapture Henderson Field and drive the Marines from Guadalcanal. The Japanese had been reinforcing their positions for weeks, using the cover of darkness to land troops and supplies despite constant harassment from American aircraft and PT boats. General Harukichi Hyakutake had arrived to personally command what Imperial headquarters called the final offensive. Nearly 30,000 Japanese troops were now concentrated on the island, facing approximately 23,000 Americans. Lieutenant General Millard Harmon, commanding all Army forces in the South Pacific, had flown in from Noumea to coordinate with Vandegrift. The 2 generals understood that this battle would determine not just the fate of Guadalcanal, but possibly the entire Pacific campaign. Failure here would give the Japanese a springboard for attacks on Australia and New Zealand. The Japanese plan was characteristically complex and ambitious. 3 separate forces would converge on Henderson Field from different directions. While naval units provided fire support and air cover, the main assault would come from the south, where General Tadashi Sumiyoshi's artillery had been moved into position. To support the infantry advance, Colonel Herman Hannikin's 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, occupied positions along the Matanikau River, where intelligence suggested the primary Japanese assault would fall. The Marines had learned hard lessons about Japanese tactics over the past 3 months, and they prepared their defenses with grim efficiency. The preliminary bombardment began at dawn on November 20th. Japanese artillery, including large caliber guns that had been laboriously moved through the jungle, pounded Marine positions with devastating accuracy. The bombardment was followed by air attacks from Rabaul-based bombers that targeted Henderson Field and the surrounding defensive positions. Private First Class John Day, manning a forward observation post, watched through his binoculars as Japanese infantry began emerging from the jungle. The enemy soldiers moved with the fluid grace of men who had spent months learning to fight in this green hell. Their camouflage was nearly perfect, and they seemed to appear and disappear like jungle spirits, according to declassified military intelligence reports from the Pacific Theater. The Japanese had committed their finest troops to this offensive. The soldiers were veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, led by officers who had studied American tactics and weaknesses for months. The battle developed into a series of savage engagements that raged across the island's interior. Japanese infiltration tactics, perfected through years of jungle warfare, allowed small units to penetrate deep into American lines before being discovered and eliminated. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, with bayonets and combat knives deciding the fate of individual positions. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Page found himself commanding a critical defensive position when his platoon leader was killed in the opening minutes of the assault. Armed with a water-cooled machine gun, Page moved from position to position, firing on Japanese attackers who seemed to emerge from the jungle like phantoms. The Marines' superior firepower began to tell as the battle progressed. American artillery, coordinated by forward observers who had learned to call in strikes with pinpoint accuracy, broke up Japanese formations before they could mass for assault. The new proximity-fused shells were particularly effective against troops in the open. Aircraft from Henderson Field provided crucial close air support. Despite constant attacks from Japanese fighters, Marine pilots, flying obsolete Wildcats, and dauntless dive bombers pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. Major Robert Gaylor and Captain Joe Foss emerged as the leading aces, their victories helping to maintain American air superiority over the battlefield. The battle reached its climax on November 23rd, when Japanese forces made their final, desperate push toward Henderson Field. The assault came at dawn, with thousands of soldiers emerging from the jungle in a coordinated attack that threatened to overwhelm the Marine defenders. But the Japanese had underestimated both the strength of American defenses and the determination of the men who manned them. The Marines, supported by Army reinforcements and coordinated artillery fires, held their ground despite overwhelming odds. The jungle around Henderson Field became a killing ground, where Japanese hopes for victory in the Pacific died alongside thousands of their finest soldiers. By November 25th, the Japanese offensive had collapsed. General Hyakutake, his forces shattered and his supply lines severed, ordered a general withdrawal to the western end of the island. The Marines had won the decisive battle for Guadalcanal, but the campaign was far from over. Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion moved through the jungle like ghosts, their faces painted with mud and their weapons wrapped in canvas to muffle sound. It was December 5, 1942, and the Raiders were conducting what would become known as the Long Patrol, a month-long reconnaissance mission behind Japanese lines that would prove the enemy was finally retreating. The Japanese withdrawal from their positions around Henderson Field had been conducted with characteristic discipline and stealth. Rather than surrender or fight to the death, they had melted back into the jungle, leaving behind carefully prepared defensive positions and supply dumps. But American intelligence was uncertain whether this represented a strategic withdrawal or merely a tactical repositioning. Lieutenant Colonel William Whaling led his scout sniper detachment, On parallel patrols, seeking evidence of Japanese intentions, the Marines had learned to read the jungle like a book, interpreting broken branches, disturbed earth, and abandoned equipment as clues to enemy movements. The skill had been bought with blood over the past for months of continuous combat. The evidence they found painted a clear picture of Japanese desperation. Supply dumps contained spoiled rice and captured American equipment, indicating that the enemy was running short of everything from ammunition to medical supplies. The famous Tokyo Express supply runs had been reduced to a trickle by aggressive American air and naval attacks. Major General Patch, who had assumed command of ground forces from the exhausted Van Degrift, coordinated the pursuit operations. With methodical precision, the American strategy was simple: maintain constant pressure on the retreating Japanese, while preventing them from establishing new defensive positions. The Marines and Army units worked in close coordination, their tactics refined through months of jungle warfare. The Japanese rear guard, composed of elite troops commanded by Colonel Matsuda, fought a series of delaying actions that demonstrated their tactical skill and determination. Each defensive position was carefully prepared and tenaciously held until the last possible moment. The retreating army moved with the discipline of professional soldiers, despite their desperate circumstances. As referenced in contemporary accounts. From war correspondent John Hersey, the psychological impact of the Japanese withdrawal was enormous. After months of defensive fighting, the Americans were finally advancing, pushing an enemy that had seemed invincible back through the jungle they had once dominated. The naval situation around Guadalcanal had also shifted dramatically in favor of the Americans. The completion of Henderson Field's expansion allowed for the basing of larger aircraft, including B-17 flying fortresses that could reach Japanese bases at Rabaul. The airfield that had been the target of so many enemy attacks was now launching strikes against Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands. Captain Bruce McCandless, who had survived the naval battle of November 13th, now commanded a destroyer that was part of the expanded American naval presence around Guadalcanal. The Tokyo Express runs that had once terrorized Marine defenders were now met by coordinated air and sea attacks that sent many Japanese ships to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese position became increasingly untenable as American reinforcements continued to arrive. The 14th Corps, under General Patch's command, now included multiple Army divisions that had been rushed to the theater. From training bases in the United States, these fresh troops, equipped with the latest weapons and supported by abundant supplies, represented a stark contrast to the exhausted Japanese garrison. The enemy's final position was established around Cape Esperance, on the northwestern tip of the island. Here, the Japanese had prepared a series of defensive positions that took advantage of the rugged terrain and limited approach routes. The position was strong, but it was also a trap. There was no escape route if the defenses were breached. The American assault on Cape Esperance began on January 10, 1943. The attack was preceded by the heaviest artillery bombardment of the entire campaign, with guns ranging from 75mm pack howitzers to massive 8-inch coastal defense weapons that had been moved to the island. The bombardment was followed by coordinated air strikes that left the Japanese positions smoking ruins. The final phase of the battle was swift and decisive. American infantry, supported by tanks and flamethrowers, overwhelmed the Japanese defenses in a series of coordinated assaults. The enemy, trapped between the advancing Americans and the sea, fought with desperate courage, but could not prevent the inevitable collapse of their position. The last organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal ended on February 9, 1943. The campaign had lasted 6 months and cost both sides enormous casualties, but it had achieved its strategic objective. The Japanese advance across the Pacific had been stopped, and the long road to Tokyo had begun. The morning sun cast long shadows across Henderson Field as General Alexander Vandegrift prepared for the ceremony that would mark the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. It was February 9, 1943, and the airfield that had been the focal point of 6 months of savage fighting was now firmly in American hands. The cost of victory was written in the faces of the Marines who had survived the ordeal. Sergeant John Bassalone stood at attention, his Medal of Honor gleaming on his chest. As General Vandegrift read the citation, that would make him the most decorated enlisted Marine of the war. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted on the same coral airstrip where Japanese bombs had once fallen like rain. The juxtaposition of peaceful ceremony and recent carnage was not lost on the assembled Marines. The statistics of the campaign were staggering. American casualties totaled over 7,000, with nearly 1,700 killed in action. The Japanese losses were even more severe, with an estimated 25,000 soldiers killed and thousands more evacuated as medical casualties. The naval losses on both sides had been equally devastating, with dozens of warships resting. On the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, whose leadership on Bloody Ridge had saved Henderson Field, reflected on the transformation of the Marines who had survived the campaign. They had landed as green recruits, many of them straight from training camps in the United States. They were leaving as hardened veterans who had learned to fight and win in the most difficult conditions imaginable. The jungle itself bore the scars of battle. Thousands of shell craters pocked the landscape, while the remains of aircraft and vehicles littered clearings throughout the island. The native population, caught between two armies, had suffered terribly. Many villages had been destroyed, and the survivors faced years of rebuilding their shattered communities. But the true significance of the Guadalcanal campaign extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces had met the Japanese in sustained combat and emerged victorious. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered on the beaches and ridges of a remote island that most Americans had never heard of before the war. As documented in the official Marine Corps' history of the campaign, the lessons learned on Guadalcanal would shape American tactics for the remainder of the Pacific War. The Marines had learned to fight in the jungle, to coordinate air and ground operations, and to sustain combat operations over extended periods. These skills would prove invaluable in the island-hopping campaigns that followed. The Japanese, for their part, had learned equally valuable lessons about American capabilities and determination. The soldiers who had been evacuated from Guadalcanal carried with them a new respect for their enemies and a sobering understanding of the industrial might that America could bring to bear in the Pacific. The Japanese high command began to shift from offensive to defensive strategies. Recognizing that their window of opportunity was closing, Admiral Chester Nimitz, visiting the island to personally congratulate the victorious Marines, spoke of the campaign's broader significance. The battle for Guadalcanal, he said, was not just a fight for a single island. It was a fight for the future of the Pacific, and through your courage and sacrifice, you have secured that future for generations of Americans yet unborn. The evacuation of the Japanese garrison, conducted with typical efficiency under cover of darkness, marked the end of organized enemy resistance. The remnants of what had once been a formidable force slipped away into the night, leaving behind equipment, weapons, and the dreams of empire that had brought them to this remote corner of the Pacific. The Marines, who had fought on Guadalcanal, would carry the memories of their ordeal for the rest of their lives. They had seen friends die in the jungle, had fought hand-to-hand with an enemy who showed no mercy, and had endured hardships that tested the limits of human endurance. But they had also experienced the unique bond that forms between men who have faced death together and emerged victorious. The legacy of Guadalcanal would echo through the remaining years of the Pacific War. The tactics developed in the jungle, the lessons learned in blood, and the confidence gained through victory would serve American forces well in the campaigns that followed. From Tarawa to Iwo Jima, from Saipan to Okinawa, the Marines would carry with them the knowledge that they could defeat any enemy anywhere, under any conditions. As the last transport ships disappeared over the horizon, carrying the survivors of the Guadalcanal campaign to hospitals and rest areas, the island settled into an uneasy peace. The jungle began to reclaim the battlefield, covering the scars of war with new growth. But the memory of what had been accomplished on this remote island would live on, a testament to the courage and sacrifice of the men who had fought there. The battle for Guadalcanal was over, but the war for the Pacific had only just begun. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but the Marines had proven that it was a road that could be traveled. The price of victory had been high, but the alternative, defeat and the triumph of tyranny, was unthinkable. The young men who had landed on those beaches in August 1942 had grown old in the space of 6 months, but they had also helped to change the course of history.